Hi there. Just a heads up that this podcast contains content about experiences of mental health difficulties and eating disorders.
You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World, conversation with researchers about the path they have taken to help shape everyday lives. Hello, I am Marta Francesconi. I'm a lecturer in psychology, also based in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at IOE. I am mainly interested in researching factors that are predictive of mental health problems in children and adolescents. Speaking of which, in this season of Research for the Real World, it's all about mental health. We'll be hearing from researchers whose work encompasses diverse areas such as eating disorders, behavior, sleep, and humanitarian emergencies, and the impact that it has on the well being. We are delighted to have Dr. Amy Harrison in the studio today. Amy works within the Department of Psychology and Human Development at IOE, UCL Faculty of Education and Society. She researches cognitive and social emotional factors that are involved in the onset and maintenance of eating disorders. Her research focuses on social emotional functioning and cognitive skills in eating disorders. Specifically, her research looks at understanding the cognitive and social emotional factors that might lead and to perpetuate eating disorders. And Amy is also interested in translating her findings into new treatments. I had the pleasure to work closely with her on one of the research projects that she led on eating disorder. And she is also a new Research for the Real World presenter. And as is custom on the podcast, the best way to getting to know them is also by putting them through their paces as an interviewee too. So welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, it's lovely to be here. And I'm very excited to be doing this podcast with my best friend and long-term collaborator, Dr. Lot Sternum, who is an assistant professor in clinical psychology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So welcome to Lot.
Hi, Lot.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. This is really, I feel very honored. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I'm very happy to have you both here. So let's start right away with the first question, Amy. Could you tell us a bit about your research journey?
Oh, I'd love to. It has been a journey. I absolutely love learning, and I was so lucky when I got a place at university to study psychology. I just loved learning about all the different studies, the different areas of psychology. And I chose to study psychology because I was really interested in mental health and clinical psychology. And I loved doing my final year research project, which was on eating disorders. I was looking at emotions and bulimia nervosa. And I did a really interesting study where I was looking at anger and disgust. And I never looked back. I always wanted to work in the field of eating disorders. I actually thought I would be a clinician. I am a clinical psychologist and I've done the clinical psychology training. But leading up to getting a place on that course, I got an amazing opportunity to do a PhD. And that's in fact where I met Lot, who was a fellow PhD student. And I loved that role. I learned so much. I mean, it really was an amazing apprenticeship. I learned how to develop a research question. I really loved working with the participants, doing the clinical interviews, collecting the experimental data. That was really one of my most favourite parts. It always has been in research. And then, of course, learning how to analyse the data and write it up and present it at conferences. There was a lot of big leaps I had to take. I was very, very nervous to present my work and give a public talk. So I had to practice that a lot. and just really refine my writing skills. It's always an ongoing process, that one. Yes, lots laughing because we have had some funny feedback sometimes from peer reviewers questioning whether either of us is a native English speaker, which I think that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think we sent quite a short answer, didn't we? Yes, one of us certainly is.
Yeah, that was quite funny. And it is a challenge, isn't it, to write something up really well?
It's hard.
Yeah, that's been interesting. And I've always kept a foot in the research field. Even when I was working as a clinician, we did some really interesting projects on the ward, testing out ideas in groups and getting patients to give us feedback. I did quite a few projects like that. And then since I've been at UCL, I've had lots of opportunities to develop my research further, particularly around the area I'm really interested in is the social emotional functioning and how people actually process emotions, manage emotions, and how they use their cognitive skills to make decisions. And I really love this work. It can be really challenging at times. It's hard to get grants. There's lots of pressure and deadlines and you're juggling lots of different things at once, but it's so interesting. And what's really interesting to me in my journey is just how much the field has changed in the couple of decades that I've been involved in this work. There's so many more studies on emotions and eating disorders, social skills and eating disorders.
Yes, I've noticed that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
It's brilliant.
Blossomed in lots of different ways. The kind of more biological, genetic research, is just really moving ahead. But also what we know about what helps and what works. And I've done a lot of work working with people's loved ones. And Lotte and I did a really great project recently. We got some funding from UCL to do some workshops with carers, people's loved ones, and to give them information and skills. So we translated it all, to the Netherlands, didn't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was really good fun. So now those groups are available for people's families and supporters in the Netherlands. Yeah, so my research journey has been quite windy and, has had lots of successes, but it's also had lots of low points, rejections and the rejections.
This is the part that we all know very well.
Yeah,
I know, it's just heartbreaking, isn't it?
It really is. And one thing I've learned is that you can't have your self-esteem depending on whether or not your paper's accepted or whether or not you get a grant.
That's right.
You have to have other things making up your self-evaluation, because otherwise you can get very desperate. And, it's good to do this work with lovely other people. And, I think just to sort of finish my answer, I think one of the things that really is very joyous to me is supporting others, because, early on, my PhD supervisor gave me this big break and gave me this massive opportunity that I've, relished and really just run with. And, she saw my potential. And so I love to pass that on and give other people opportunities and support them and mentor them and nurture them. And that gives me a lot of enjoyment and joy to see other researchers, other scientists doing well. I really enjoy that as part of the work. And then it doesn't really matter if you get rejections because someone else is doing okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it is so key in this, probably most careers, but also definitely for us. If you have a good mentor, I think it can make a world of difference.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe not necessarily in output, but definitely in joy and in sort of whether you continue it. And I think you and I both, Amy, have been, obviously you were part of a similar environment, the same team at King's College. And I think we've been incredibly lucky. I really also think that my supervisor has really opened the doors for me, and not necessarily in just sort of her name on my papers, but more to show me what's out there and to give me the opportunity to take part and to run with it, really.
Absolutely. It really makes a
Which
difference.
is really very special. If I sometimes hear stories of my colleagues, or I see things at my department and I think, oof, I really was incredibly lucky there.
Yeah.
And I hope that for all of my students, I can do the same thing. I really try to adhere to, I want to help you run and fly.
Yeah.
And I want you to develop yourself, and I'm fully behind you and I'll guide you. And in a very positive way, rather than sort of it's my work, you need to do it, but it's mine.
Yeah, I often hear sort of, the research environment is very competitive. It's a bit cutthroat and things like this. But I don't know. I don't really join in with that. I suppose my thing is, if you build other people up, you will shine, and you'll shine through them and with them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
You don't lose anything either, right? We sometimes,
No.
I've had a colleague who wasn't so keen on a master student being sort of third author, despite this student collecting all of the data for a quite complex study, and despite the student writing 80% of the manuscript, and doing 80% of the data analysis. And I just thought, what would you lose by doing that? I just, it's quite alien to me to not do that. So I still stuck around.
Yeah, I couldn't agree
paper, I'm the
more,
boss.
Amy. I am one of the early career that you supported, wonderfully supported. So I mean, I experienced this kind of approach that you have to research, and I have to say that that is one of the reasons why it's amazing to be working with you. And it's interesting to hear that the reason why you are acting this way is because you've been exposed to this style, and this is how you learned, because it worked to me the same after I've seen how you were handling your project, collaborating with earlier career. I thought like, oh wow, it's amazing how she's supporting me, and I want to do the same with others. So
Oh, that's wonderful. I
yeah.
was so proud of you when you got the job in the department as a lecturer. I mean, it was just brilliant. And it also means it's a win-win because we still get to do cool things together.
Exactly. It was a win-win.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a support, like a 360 degree support, not only like research wise, but also like with technicality, admin things. It's always good like to have collaborators that you can trust and rely on if anything happens. So yeah, I
It
think
makes a big
a very
difference.
big difference. Yeah.
And the other thing I'd add to that is you've also got to have the odd party.
True.
Yes,
You've
you
got to have
That
a
is
bit of
another
fun.
important part. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I think that actually, when it comes to research careers, I think there's the part of, being a PhD student. And I remember we spent quite a few Friday evenings in a particular pub in London.
Just Fridays.
And and then gosh, I miss those days. And then now I'm a mother of 3 young daughters, and I definitely am not in that atmosphere anymore. And I really do miss it, because actually there's, other than sort of just letting your hair down and sort of charging your battery, it often also was a place, that socializing, where you'd get together, you'd sort of connect with people, you'd, weirdly enough, we would love our job so much, so we'd often end up continuing talking about our job, and we'd actually kind of, rebuild creative ideas around it. And I definitely at this stage in my life miss that a little bit, that social part of it.
Yeah, you're really making me think about my, the question about my research journey, because that's something that's changed a bit since I've had my son, Joshua, who's 3. And yeah, I used to work really long hours, and, I would work in the evenings, I would work in the weekends. And yeah, Josh has changed that, because obviously I need to look after him, and I want to look after him and spend time with him. But it's probably made me a little bit more efficient, I suppose, because I know I've got more limited time. But it's also presented some interesting barriers, I think, because sometimes things have really short turnaround times, and they necessitate you working outside of your normal hours if you want to do them. I would say particularly applying for grants, because they just do take a really long time to get the writing right, and get the idea right, and get the kind of delivery of what you want to do right, and of course to organize all your collaborators and so on. And I think that has been more like a bit of my journey that's become more challenging, and I certainly do have to look for ones that have sort of longer deadlines, and where I think feasibly I could actually write something for this. But that's also something about personal development, isn't it? Hopefully
older they get.
I don't know, maybe something else would have changed to stop me working all hours, but I am very
You
hardworking,
are,
and
Amy.
sometimes that's to my
You
sometimes.
definitely are. You're still managing
Oh, thank you.
everything exceptionally. So,
Oh, you're so kind.
I think
Thank
in a way, Amy, do you not also find that, sort of 10 years ago, I definitely, when I didn't have children yet, I definitely would say that I got excited. I still get excited about a lot of different things, but then I would grab almost anything. And so if someone would say, "Hey, I'm intending to run this project, can I brainstorm with you? Would you, want to be part of the team?" I'd be, yes, yes, obviously. And now my first thing is go, yes. And then I go, ooh, hold on a second.
you.
How am I gonna? And in a way, I find that really difficult because I am an excitable researcher, and I think part of my power is the energy I also get from it, and the excitement, the enthusiasm I have. But I really more often now, way more often, kind of go, really interesting project, but does this make sense? When exactly am I going to be doing this? And very often the answer is, I actually don't think I can.
Yeah, and that's quite a hard thing to
Yeah, which
learn,
I do
isn't
think
it?
is a hard thing to learn.
Yeah.
I definitely miss the days of just, sort of being just in the research bubble where you do, where you just think continuously and you have quick thought processes and sort of throw a ball at someone. And I think you and I are always really good at that. And then, you throw the ball back and you sort of learn from what someone else says in a different perspective. And then the story is created, if you like the theoretical model is created as you go along. And there's a lot less time for that. I think also to do with other responsibilities. So in terms of teaching, I have a very heavy teaching load, and I think that and other teaching responsibilities and policy in my department. And I definitely think that also means there's just not always the space to be as creative and as thoughtful, but also as critical or as on the ball as I have been able to be.
well,
Yeah, I think that was a strategy I adopted, just to say yes to everything, because I really wanted to learn and I wanted to develop. And I think it's paid off. It's, I've done well, but it's also, at times been very tiring, and I've probably neglected other parts of my life a bit.
Yeah, I recognize that as well.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I'm still learning to say no to things. So that's an
well,
ongoing
it
work.
means that like you need to refine your decision making skills, right? Speaking of which,
Well,
uh,
speaking of
going
which,
back to our eating disorder journey, why do you think it is important to understand more about cognition and social emotional skills in people with eating disorders?
yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think one way of understanding eating disorders is that they're emotion regulation problems. So, if you're in a difficult emotional state, a lot of people will have different strategies to care for themselves and to do something about how they feel. And what we find in eating disorders is that the eating disorder behaviors are a way of managing emotions. So people might do things like restricting how much they eat because it temporarily kind of blocks things out or makes you feel a bit numb and a bit knocked off. I would argue you still are feeling something, but yeah, it can take the edge off maybe. Or people might be, sort of feeling a bit out of control and getting into behaviors like binging and purging. And then, of course, there's lots of feelings that you have after something like that. Often people can feel a lot of shame and guilt and distress about their body and distress about, do I feel safe in this world? Am I doing things right? Do people like me? Am I wanted? And so I think emotions are really at the heart of eating disorders. And often the thing that happens is that the eating disorder sort of isolates people and it takes them out of the typical social life. And, eating disorders can hit at any point in the lifespan, but a common time for them to sort of first strike is during your adolescence. And of course, that's a time when you're really trying to refine and develop more sophisticated social skills and also more sophisticated cognitive skills like advanced complex decision-making skills, planning, trying to organize yourself, trying to make sense of a complex social world. And I think people can get a bit out of that. Sometimes that's desirable because it can be quite overwhelming and stressful. And so, not joining in and not being able to go and eat with others is a good reason to sort of not have to face all of that. And then I think people can often get a bit out of practice, or they miss the kind of developmental opportunities that other peers might get to practice things like managing conflict, or being okay with yourself, that not everyone's going to absolutely love you. Hopefully lots of people will like you, but you're never going to please everybody and meet everybody's needs. And I think that's a really important part of adolescent development. And eating disorders can kind of steal that away a little bit. And then, of course, they can get really stuck, and people's kind of behaviours get shaped around them. And the reasons why they were doing those behaviours in the first place, might not be really there anymore, but the behaviour is still cued. And people can get very stuck in habits and find it difficult to shift out. And so I think there's lots of opportunities there to help and support and coach people. So I think social emotional functioning and eating disorders is very key. And another reason why it's key actually is because you can't really get out of these things on your own. It's very difficult to recover from an eating disorder by yourself. And that's really hard because often people don't want to bother others. They don't want to be visible. They don't want to be, I don't know, I suppose it can be really difficult to ask for help because that's a kind of statement that something's not right. I'm not perfect. I'm not really doing very well. Really, the social support is what people talk about in recovery as being really vital. So you need some social skills to be able to access that and to make good use of it. So it kind of comes full circle. And that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think, and this is maybe also linking back to what you said earlier, Amy, about how the last sort of 10, 20 years, I think there's lots more about eating disorders that we are learning. And I think maybe one of the shifts is to move away from just trying to treat the eating disorder symptoms, such as the behaviors and the cognitions, but actually to see a much more full-rounded person and to kind of say, actually, there's quite a few things that you might struggle with, and we can now sort of reduce your eating disorder cognitions, but quite possibly if you then continue with life, the underlying issues might still be there. You might still feel very uncomfortable in your classroom due to wanting to do everything perfectly well, or due to being so worried about what other people think of you, that unless we actually address this and we help you with these skills to improve on that, you may relapse really quickly, or you may develop other problems. So I think that's maybe also a shift that we're seeing.
Yeah, the consideration of the comorbidity as well, the co-occurring symptoms like the anxiety that we've looked at together in our work, I think is really important, isn't it? Because that's kind of underpinning, one of the reasons why people get stuck. If I feel really anxious about something, then I might try and avoid it. But the problem is the next time that I have to face it again, I still feel anxious. And that's the crux of having to eat scary things or having to resist behaviours and do something else. That's how you change, really. You have to face these scary things. And that's really hard when you're overwhelmed with emotion and the physiological sensation of it, and your cognitive skills are still developing. And it's hard to make an advantageous decision. It's a very difficult thing to change and overcome. And that's why we need to keep working with people with experience of eating disorders to really figure that out.
Because it's difficult for any adolescent, isn't it? I mean, there's a reason that they say that adolescence is such a complex period for people, because all those developing skills, and then you're not sure what to do where, and emotions are at rile. And I think having that in someone, and then adding to that sort of a little bit of a messed up biological system, right? With either being majorly undernourished, or, sort of doing lots of binging and purging, which also sets off different biological processes. Throw that in the mix, and you make it more and more complex.
Yeah. Amy, would you give us an example of a study that has looked at cognition or social-emotional functioning in eating disorders?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about my PhD study actually, because what was really nice about it was it had the kind of cold cognitive side, so I suppose how people process information. And then it also had the hot cognitive side, which was more about how people process emotions. And what this work was trying to look at was a contemporary model of eating disorders called the cognitive interpersonal maintenance model. And this is a model that tries to explain some of the things that keep people stuck in eating disorders. So there might be something about the way you process information, your cognitive style. There might be something about how you do emotions, how you express them, how you regulate them, how you recognize them. And my study was really trying to look at that in people who were currently experiencing an eating disorder, so acute illness, and also compare it to people who'd had an eating disorder but were now recovered, and then a group of people who'd never had eating disorders. So I had lots of really interesting cognitive tasks that come from neuropsychology. So I had some tasks that looked at what's called set shifting. And that's, let's say you're following a rule. You've detected there's a rule that you need to stick to and you're following it. But then something changes and you have to shift your rule. You have to switch it to a new rule for things to work. So we had a couple of tasks looking at that. And then we had some tasks that were looking at whether people are good at processing information in the context in a kind of gestalt way, in the bigger picture, or are they really good at the detail? Do they kind of build up a representation of things in their mind kind of from the bottom up? And some of these tasks had been used, or they'd been used quite extensively actually in autism spectrum disorder. And there was quite the start really of a movement in the field to think about these cognitive styles and whether they might be overlapping. And then I had some really nice experimental tasks. I had a Stroop task, an emotional Stroop task, where, that's taken me back a bit, but that's where people were looking at different faces and the faces were presented in different colours. And if that emotion is quite salient to you, if it means something to you, or if it's very striking or significant in some way, it will take you a bit longer to say the name of the colour of the picture because you're processing the emotional components of it. Yeah, and then I had one that was about recognising emotions, and another one that was about regulating emotions. That was really fun actually. So I had just the eyes, and people had to say what the person was thinking or feeling just from seeing the eyes. And then I had this cartoon, a series of cartoons, and there was some sort of frustrating situation. And as a participant, you had to say what the character might say or do. So it'll be like you're in the cinema, someone's come and sat in front of you and they've got a massive hat on and they're blocking your way. What would you do?
I love those tasks. They're brilliant.
It was really fun. Yeah, the participants like that too. So what I found was people with eating disorders were very, very good at the detail. So in fact, on the tasks that really benefited a detail focus, sometimes I couldn't stop my stopwatch quick enough. Yeah. People were that good. Mm-hmm. It was amazing. And people without eating disorders took a really long time actually, but they seemed to do a bit better. They performed well on the tasks that required the bigger picture thinking. So we asked them to copy a complex figure and then later on recall some of it. And, if you fragment it and you break it up into lots of bits, you've got more to remember, like a phone number. If you remember every number, you probably forget a few, but if you chunk it into smaller bits, sections, you can largely remember the whole thing. And yeah, the people that hadn't experienced eating disorders seemed to do well at the bigger picture, not as good at the detail, and then vice versa for the eating disorder group. Yeah, it was really interesting. And then perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that people with eating disorders, they were sort of suboptimal on the emotion regulation tasks. So they weren't scoring really, really low, but they were scoring below their peers. And they were definitely scoring below what we would have expected given their general IQ. So there's some inefficiencies there. And the very interesting thing was the recovered group. So I looked at people with anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, and then I looked at this group of individuals who'd recovered, and they sort of had an intermediate profile. So they weren't quite the same as people that had never had eating disorders, but they also weren't quite the same as they were somewhere in the middle, really, between the controls and the eating disorder group. I think what the other thing I learned from that work was that people that had a more severe illness, so people that had been unwell for longer, whose weight was, more severely low. I mean, I should point out that most eating disorders don't involve low weight, but this was a group where I did have people from an inpatient unit, so they did have very low weights. This group with this very severe form of illness that had gone on for a long time, that, people that had more symptoms as well on measures of eating disorder symptoms, they were in the most detail focused. They were not doing so well at the bigger picture, and they really, really struggled more so with the social emotional skills. And really from that, I built sort of a whole research trajectory of looking at different aspects of this, and went on to look at things like people's non-verbal communication, their body language, or how they express emotions in their face, or people's experience of their social emotional functioning and how it impacts their day-to-day life.
That's very interesting. First of all, because you had like very comprehensive way of assessing cognitive function, like you administer so many tasks. What was the criterion for recovery? How did you define the recovery group?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, that is a really good question. So people have written about how you might define recovery in research, and I drew on their suggestions. So I think if I remember correctly, people had to score below the clinical threshold on an eating disorder measure. And I mean, it was a bit weight biased, I think, but we also said people shouldn't be underweight. We also said that people
Probably
should have
no
been
binging and purging behaviors.
not having those symptoms, I think, for a few years.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very difficult because there are lots of people that live, really great lives in spite of symptoms. And, there are lots of people I've worked with that say, sometimes under times of stress, these symptoms come back and they still bother me, but I'd consider myself recovered. Recovery can be very subjective.
Yes.
But I think from a scientific perspective, to try and differentiate, because we had to rule out some of the potential confounding variables, that was how we defined it.
Okay, that's very interesting. I would also be curious to hear. Well, I know this project, but I would like you to tell others too about the Medical Research Council funded study on decision making and eating disorder project that we work on together. If you can tell some about this study.
Yeah, I mean, I was so delighted we got this funding. It was such an interesting project. So we looked at data from the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a cohort data set, and it's a group of over 16,000 young people who were born in the year 2000, and they've been followed up lots of times. And in the data set, there were some measures of how people make decisions under conditions of risk, and the participants had taken a gambling task. And we also had some data on symptoms that are perhaps indicative of eating disorder, the presence of eating disorder symptoms, like if people are wanting to reduce the amount that they're eating, or if they're actively doing that, how much exercise they're doing, how satisfied they are with their body. And what we found was that the decision-making skills at age 11 and 14 were associated with the presence of eating disorder symptoms in later adolescence, at 14 and 17.
So interesting.
And, there's not so many longitudinal studies in our field. So this was really interesting. And one of the really interesting findings to me was that the group that had the eating disorder symptoms, between the ages of 11 and 14, their decision-making skills developed a bit less slowly than their peers. And I think, this potential... Yeah, exactly. So their peers kind of continued to develop their skills. And the eating disorder group, or the people that went on to develop the symptoms later, their trajectory of development was a bit was less.
Okay.
So they didn't improve as much
Yeah.
between those two time points, between 11 and 14. And there are models of eating disorders that suggest a kind of neurodevelopmental pathway. And I thought that was really interesting. And people might say, oh, well, gambling task and eating disorder symptoms, how are they related? I mean, when you start getting into eating disorders, you make loads of decisions. You choose to eat in a different way or exercise in a different way or have a different view of food. And you think that will make me feel less distressed, or it make me feel safer, or make me, whatever it is that you're wanting. And I think what we know is that for not everybody who goes on a diet develops an eating disorder, but for people that go on to develop eating disorders, that's not an advantageous choice. There are other things that they could do to feel better, or to feel safer, or to feel more in control, or whatever it is that they're looking for. And that then switches on, I suppose, this different relationship with your body, weight and shape and food. And so one of the things that I guess I've learned from that work is that, is there a way to protect against making those more disadvantageous choices early on, so that we might be able to almost inoculate people against developing these really quite vicious illnesses that sadly kill and maim people.
They're awful.
They stick around and they can last on average 7 years, and that's quite shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just a person themselves, isn't it? It's also the loved ones that, families are sort of being ripped apart, and it's so hard.
So it's very disruptive to people to have to keep going into services and hospitals and, not being able to be in their communities with their loved ones. And
Yeah, one very interesting thing about this study, like one of the biggest positive side, was that we used like this large data set. And so we had access to so many people data. And also like the fact that we use data from a general population, which is slightly different from the use of a clinical population, right? So I was wondering, is there any findings that you found particularly surprising to you?
There was one that was very surprising to me, and it was one of the questions that had been asked at age 14 and 17 about body dissatisfaction and how dissatisfied people were with their body weight and shape. And we didn't really have a large proportion of people endorsing that item and saying, yes, I am dissatisfied, even though we had over half of the sample actively intending to or restricting the amount they were eating to change their weight and shape.
That is interesting.
Yeah, isn't it? Because I suppose I've always thought, well, I suppose listening to people who've experienced eating disorders, there's often a story about, I was dissatisfied in some way, so I tried to do something about it. But I don't know whether, because unfortunately, in the longer term, diets don't work. Maybe, they don't achieve the intended effects of truly feeling good about yourself. Sometimes they can make people put on more weight or, struggle more with food. And so maybe the process of that kind of switches on the more dissatisfaction and it comes a bit later. But I think we could potentially look at this, because I know that the next sweep of data is going to be available, isn't it? So maybe we can see whether, it's been measured later on. Did it sort of turn on with the more dieting behaviours that people did? We might be able to test that. But that was, Marta, that's such a good question. That was quite surprising to me.
Okay, so it was something that you were not expecting to see on a general population cohort. And since you measure like some ideas for next steps, for example, like going to investigate the next sweep of the Millennium Course study, do you have any other idea of what to do with these findings?
Yeah, well, if you've got any time on your hands, Marta, let's get that
Where
next
is she going to
data
start?
We'll start now. So we've together been thinking, I mean, this has been quite a long time in the planning, but we've been thinking about whether we could make some sort of game that people could play to develop really advantageous decision-making skills.
Wonderful.
So thinking about kind of children, young people. And I was really fortunate last year, I got this UCL Public Health Impact Fellowship. And as part of that, I was able to do a little project engaging with the public. And I worked with young people to actually co-design the game and what the platform would look like, what the characters would be, what the scenarios would be. And I think the
That's
idea
great.
would be, it was
That's
really
great.
fun to then, work with computer scientists, programmers to actually develop that game and pilot it and see whether, if we give it to people and then follow them up, can it help to protect against some symptoms coming on later in adolescence? So that's one area of development, I think.
Great.
Yeah,
that'd be so interesting, I think, and so valuable. And I think it's such a good idea to involve these young people. And I think that's another thing that's happening, isn't it? Definitely within our field, that more and more, luckily, the importance of actually getting the people for whom we're doing this to think along and to, rather than to kind of go, okay, from my research perspective, I think this is what you need, actually kind of to say, and what do you think? Do you think this will actually be useful? And to kind of check in. And I love the English word co-develop. And it's interesting because Holland is definitely a little bit behind on England in terms of accepting and, sort of reveling in the idea that the target group should be involved in research projects. And they're only starting to do it now. So a term in Dutch as beautiful as co-developing doesn't even really exist, whereas it's so key, I think.
Yeah, this co-design, co-production, it's brilliant because you just get to work together with amazing people, and it's just much more efficient and effective, I think. I mean, it's interesting because Lot and I have done quite a few projects now on this idea of intolerance of uncertainty. And this is an anxiety process. And it's the idea that kind of when you're faced with, a situation where you might have to make a decision or solve a problem, people kind of get frozen and they find it really stressful, and they either want to kind of avoid it or they might cope by worrying about it a lot. And I think that a sort of personality side that's possibly part of these decision-making inefficiencies potentially. And I think Lot will say a bit more about that. But I think, it's not just a cognitive thing, is it? It's something about how it feels when you have to make a decision.
So I think it's sort of living with the idea that most things in the world are extremely threatening. And just feeling that, if something is not totally clear, it's likely going to be a disaster. And I think it also has to do, we looked a little bit at attachment at some point to kind of come from the idea that, why would someone feel so unsafe in the world? Because I think that's what comes with this concept of not being able to, or getting overwhelmed and distressed and by uncertain situations. I really do think that comes from the idea that the world is probably going to be quite an unsafe place. And obviously a lot of our knowledge about this concept in the eating disorder field comes from the anxiety field, where it's a concept that has been studied across different anxiety disorders. And luckily they're really learning more every year. So it's great for me to sit back and watch what they do and then kind of implement that in our studies.
Handy. Yeah, it's interesting in the context of the task we use, because the Cambridge gambling task, there isn't really such an element of learning. It's kind of a simple task in a way that you if you choose the advantageous choices, you win the points, you get further in, you do better on the task. If better is obviously having more points at the end. But I think even in that situation, people I've worked with eating disorders, even if all the parameters are known, it still can be really challenging. Marta and I have discussed this in another podcast that we'll put a link to in the notes, with somebody that lived with anorexia nervosa, just kind of being overwhelmed with choice and not really being able not being really afraid of making the wrong choice. And, uncertainty is inherent in life, unfortunately. I mean, I don't like it either, but it is there, isn't it?
Who likes it? Well, some like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some people are more tolerant of it, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and I think there's an element here of then people involving their loved ones and them modeling and coaching and showing how to deal with these, decisions that you have to make about, it could just be buying a diary, or it could be, what university do I go to, or what do I do next in my career, or is this boyfriend or girlfriend right for me? so yeah, these are life skills, aren't they? But they can then get a bit stuck when eating disorders are there.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very nice and interesting to hear how you are going to make use of findings to translate what you found in practice and make some change, try to change at least, like
that's the
course
hope.
of the yeah, that's
the
the
aim.
hope.
That's definitely the aim.
That's that's definitely the aim. And what other project do you have in mind for the year ahead?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm working on a really interesting bid at the moment with colleagues from the arts and humanities, looking at an eating disorder that's probably the most common, but isn't particularly well researched, actually, called other specified feeding or eating disorder. And we're trying to look at how we're hoping to look at how we might define it from the lived experience of people who've had this illness, and looking at what research is out there on it and trying to summarize that, and working with a colleague in our department to use AI, machine learning, natural language processing to actually make sense of the data set that's already there.
So interesting.
Yeah,
Very
it's really, really
interesting.
interesting. Yeah. Really hoping that we'll get the go ahead and the money to go and do that, because
Fingers crossed.
What's nice about it is that it's obviously serving a more marginalized group of people that we haven't helped in research. Yeah, and explored as much as we could.
And it's actually quite a large group, I think.
Yeah. I mean, some studies I've read say binge eating disorder is the most common, but I've also read others that say this OSFED eating disorder is. And the other really nice thing about it is to work with people that are totally outside of your field. And we've just learned so much from developing this bid about how each other speaks and approaches things. And, we've all been trained a bit differently. And that's actually really
cool.
fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. I also really enjoy working with neuroscientists, because I think in a way writing stuff together or thinking up projects together, but I think mainly talking about what the results mean. I love that. I've got two colleagues who definitely are way more neuroscientists than I'll ever be. I sometimes go, well, let me get back to you. I'm going to just read up on that. I've got no idea what they're saying. But it really, the translation of sort of, okay, so we do an experimental task, in a scanner, and then someone is looking at the brain activity, and they really will be able to say, okay, if someone, for example, is doing this gambling task, we see this area of the brain more or less activated in this group, but not in the other group. And that is so interesting to then make the connection and say, gosh, but actually this is what we see. We see that this clinical group responds more or less to certain, pictures. We see that. And actually, we see that back in the brain. And I think I also find that fascinating. And I definitely for one intend to learn a bit more about that. So my current PhD student is on that a little bit more on that edge. So she's more familiar with the brain. And I love it. I learn so much. And I really, really, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's always good and nice when you also get the chance to go a bit out of your comfort zone.
Exactly. Keep your brain sharp. Yeah.
Exactly. And I have to think about things from a different angle. It's very, very interesting. So I feel like we can stay here and speak for hours.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Amy and I know that we can. Weeks.
We can have another go, but I hope that we cover somehow what was your journey and your experience, Amy. And thanks so much. It has really been interesting to revisit your career and another area of your research.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Lot, as well, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to have you. You can follow Amy on X, the website formerly known as Twitter, at Dr. Amy K. Harrison to learn more. Some of what we have covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you have enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 21 past seasons. Search IOE Podcast to find episodes of the Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And a quick favor before you go, if you're listening on an Apple Podcast or Spotify, we'd really appreciate if you could give the IOE Podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such an important work. I am Marta, and thanks for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.